The corridors of the High Court have long been the stage for some of the most intense dramas in modern history, where reputations are forged in steel or shattered into dust within a matter of minutes. For months, a quiet tension had been building behind the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, an invisible pressure that kept dozens of veteran investigative journalists and media professionals awake long into the night. This was not just another routine legal dispute over an aggressive headline or a contested quote. This was an existential battle, a coordinated and massive assault aimed directly at the heart of one of the most powerful media institutions in the modern English-speaking world. For decades, the writers, editors, and reporters of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday had operated at the very peak of the media landscape, breaking stories that shook high society, exposed deep-seated corruption, and shaped the daily conversations of millions of ordinary citizens. Yet, behind the scenes, a powerful coalition of wealthy individuals, global celebrities, and relentless critics had been quietly aligning their forces, waiting for the perfect moment to strike a blow that they hoped would not just damage these publications, but permanently silence them. To understand the gravity of what was unfolding, one must understand the unique vulnerability of those who make it their life's work to report on the rich and powerful. Every single day, journalists walk a precarious tightrope, balancing the public's right to know against the immense legal and financial resources of the elite subjects they cover. When an institution as prominent as Associated Newspapers is dragged into the harsh glare of a high-profile public trial, the shockwaves are felt across the entire industry. The allegations leveled against the publisher were not merely critical. They were deeply damaging, career-destroying accusations of systematic, unlawful information gathering that struck at the core of journalistic integrity. If these allegations were proven true, it would mean the end of careers, the total destruction of historic reputations, and potentially the financial collapse of iconic titles that had stood for generations. As the final days of the hearing approached, the atmosphere inside the newsrooms was thick with an agonizing combination of anxiety and resolve. As 40 dedicated journalists prepared to step forward into the witness box to defend their honor and their life's work under the brutal scrutiny of cross-examination. Before we uncover the dramatic turning point of this historic courtroom showdown and reveal how the scales of justice ultimately tipped, take a brief moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an exclusive inside look into the world's most fascinating media and legal dramas. The roots of this spectacular confrontation trace back through years of growing animosity between traditional print media and a specific group of high-profile individuals who felt deeply aggrieved by the relentless spotlight of public attention. For nearly a decade, a narrative had been carefully constructed by these powerful critics, suggesting that the press operated entirely outside the law, using illicit methods to peer into the private lives of the rich and famous. This group of claimants, which included global entertainment icons and high-ranking public figures, sought to use the ultimate authority of the High Court to validate their claims and essentially put the entire concept of a free press on trial. The legal strategy was clear and devastatingly simple. Launch a massive multi-front lawsuit packed with sensational claims, generate an overwhelming wave of negative public opinion, and force the publisher into a position where survival would be nearly impossible. The financial stakes alone were staggering, rapidly climbing past tens of millions of pounds, a sum that would easily bankrupt smaller organizations and cause even the largest media empires to hesitate. It was a calculated gamble by the claimants, who believed that the sheer weight of their public profiles and the gravity of their accusations would overwhelm the defense. But as any seasoned legal observer knows, the true test of any accusation does not lie in the court of public opinion, but in the cold, uncompromising light of a court of law, where rhetoric must be backed by undeniable facts. Day after day, the courtroom became a battlefield of words and memory, with the claimants presenting a dark, elaborate narrative of widespread conspiracy and corporate wrongdoing. The public watched with bated breath as names that usually graced red carpets and royal palaces were read out in connection with shady private investigators and alleged surveillance plots. It felt to many like a defining historical moment, a final reckoning that would either tarnish the media industry forever or expose a deeply coordinated effort to muzzle the press. The tension was particularly suffocating for the journalists who found themselves personally accused of participating in these alleged schemes. These were professionals who had spent their entire adult lives building relationships, chasing leads, and verifying facts under strict legal frameworks, now forced to sit in a courtroom and listen to their characters being systematically assassinated in front of the global media. The psychological toll of such an ordeal cannot be overstated, as the boundary between professional duty and personal ruin became terrifyingly thin. Yet, as the weeks passed and the cross-examinations intensified, the initial confidence of the claimants began to show subtle, critical fractures. The elaborate structure of their case, which had looked so imposing and terrifying when first presented in front-page news reports, began to face the rigorous testing of a veteran judiciary. Legal analysts began to notice that while the emotional weight of the accusations was immense, the actual concrete evidence supporting them seemed remarkably scarce. The entire dispute was rapidly accelerating toward a definitive climax, a moment where a single judge would hold the power to either reshape the future of public reporting or completely dismantle a massive multi-million-pound legal crusade. The world waited in absolute silence for the final judgment to be delivered. The climax of this extraordinary legal battle came down to a massive 436-page written judgment delivered by Mr Justice Nicklin in the High Court. A document that completely shattered the elaborate case built by the claimants. When the decision was finally read, it was not just as a minor legal victory or a partial dismissal with lingering doubts. It was an absolute, unmitigated triumph for Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. Every single claim brought against the newspapers, including the most damaging, highly publicized accusations made by Prince Harry, was entirely and completely dismissed. There were no caveats, no technical exceptions, and no hidden victories left for the celebrities who had promised to bring the media giant to its knees. For the 40-odd journalists who had spent weeks giving an account of themselves in court, under immense psychological strain, the judgment was a profound vindication of their integrity and their professional honor. The judge explicitly singled out a number of these male journalists, describing them as honest, reliable, and deeply impressive witnesses who stood up to intense cross-examination with absolute dignity. This public recognition by the High Court effectively restored reputations that had been falsely dragged through the mud for months in the full glare of global publicity. In sharp contrast, the case presented by the 7 high-profile claimants crumbled under close judicial scrutiny, revealing an astonishing lack of substance behind the sensational headlines. While the judge accepted that the individual claimants themselves believed they were telling the truth, the court found that they possessed virtually no direct evidence to support their massive allegations. The legal team for the celebrities had relied heavily on a narrative that looked spectacular in public relations campaigns, but completely dissolved when subjected to the strict rules of legal proof. The ultimate collapse of their strategy occurred when the claimant's key witness, a former private investigator named Gavin Burrows, suddenly and completely withdrew an earlier statement he had provided. Without this pivotal testimony, the entire legal foundation of the lawsuit was completely eradicated, reducing the claimants to making unsubstantiated allegations that could not survive the rigorous demands of the High Court. The only witness on the claimant's side who managed to leave an impressive impression on the court was David Furnish, the husband of Sir Elton John, but his isolated testimony was nowhere near enough to salvage a case that was fundamentally built on sand. As the details of the judgment spread, it became blindingly obvious that this had not been a simple misunderstanding or a standard courtroom dispute, but rather a deeply coordinated, multi-million-pound conspiracy to blacken the reputation of the male titles on the altar of public opinion, with the ultimate goal of closing them down permanently. The financial toll of this immense warfare was staggering to contemplate, with the total cost of the legal proceedings on both sides rapidly escalating past £50 million. Associated newspapers alone had already paid well over half of this astronomical sum just to defend its name, its editors, and its reporters from these groundless attacks, with the final determination over who will ultimately pay the costs still pending before the judge. Among those with the absolute most to lose during this exhausting ordeal was Paul Dacre, the legendary editor who had masterfully guided the Daily Mail from 1992 until 2018, shaping it into the formidable media powerhouse it is today. Along with several of his close colleagues, Mr Dacre had been viciously accused by the claimants of lying to the historic Leveson inquiry in 2012 when he stated under oath that the Mail titles had never participated in the illicit practice of phone hacking. To an editor of his global stature, whose considerable achievements had defined modern British journalism, such an accusation was not just a legal challenge, it was a direct assault on his life's work and his personal legacy. The judge, however, found absolutely no truth in these baseless allegations, completely clearing the veteran editor and restoring the honour of his lengthy tenure. Perhaps even more painful and deeply personal for Mr Dacre and his team were the accusations brought forward by Baroness Doreen Lawrence, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, a black teenager whose tragic murder by a gang of thugs in South London in 1993 became a defining moment in modern social history. Nearly 4 years after that horrific crime, when the official police investigations and attempts to charge the culprits had completely foundered, the Daily Mail had taken an extraordinary, historic risk by running its famous front page with the single, shocking headline that simply branded the suspects as murderers. While most of the traditional political establishment and several rival newspapers immediately criticized the Mail for its aggressive, unprecedented tactic, the legendary former Master of the Rolls, Lord Denning, described it as a marvelous piece of journalism. It was a measure of true greatness that a legal mind like Denning could grasp that the newspaper was fighting for absolute truth and justice, standing up for an unprivileged family that had been completely failed by the police and the prosecuting authorities. For decades, the Mail's relentless campaign for the Lawrence family was remembered as one of the finest hours of investigative journalism, which made it an incredibly bitter pill to swallow when Baroness Lawrence, for reasons that remain entirely unclear, joined the ranks of the wealthy claimants. She chose to accuse the very newspaper that had fought for her son of targeting her with unlawful information-gathering techniques, an allegation that caused immense distress to generations of journalists who had poured their hearts into her cause. The total dismissal of these claims by Mr Justice Nicklin was a powerful historical correction, proving that the bond of truth established decades ago had never been broken by the newspaper. The judgment shed a harsh light on the fact that these groundless, ruinous claims did not appear out of a clear blue sky, but were instead fueled by a web of wealthy individuals who harbored a deep systemic hatred for the free press. Chief among these hostile forces was the late Max Mosley, the immensely wealthy former Formula One president, who had spent the final years of his life waging an obsessive, well-funded crusade to damage and destroy the Mail titles. Mosley's intense animosity had peaked in 2018 when the Daily Mail definitively proved that he had been the publisher of a squalid, deeply racist election pamphlet used by his father, the notorious British fascist Oswald Mosley, back in 1961. This devastating historical revelation, which Mosley had desperately tried to keep hidden from the modern world, only increased his fierce determination to muzzle the newspaper by any means necessary. Even while suffering from terminal cancer before he tragically shot himself in May 2021, Mosley used his vast inherited fortune to heavily bankroll anti-press organizations like Hacked Off, an activist group that aggressively campaigns for state oversight and control of newspapers. The sheer scale of this financial campaign was exposed when it was revealed that Mosley had given at least £565,000 to individuals like Graham Johnson, a portion of which was explicitly used to pay witnesses to come forward against the Mail. Another prominent beneficiary of Mosley's enormous wealth was Professor Brian Cathcart, a founder member of Hacked Off, who received generous funding to write an entire book targeting the media industry. The court proceedings even revealed that one of the key individuals giving evidence on behalf of the claimants was the former Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament Dr. Evan Harris, who had once served as an executive director for Hacked Off. In a scathing assessment of his testimony, the judge described Dr. Harris as having been particularly prone to reconstruction, a polite judicial term for an unreliable witness whose memory seemed to adapt to suit his political agenda. The exposure of this deeply entrenched network of wealth, political ambition, and personal vendettas transformed the trial from a simple civil dispute into a gripping drama about the survival of independent journalism. For 11 exhausting weeks, the reporters and editors of the Mail lived under the shadow of these potentially ruinous accusations, knowing that their professional survival depended entirely on the judge's ability to see through the immense smoke and mirrors presented by the defense. The tension within the media industry was palpable, as every major publication realized that a defeat for associated newspapers would set a terrifying precedent, allowing any wealthy individual with a grievance to use the court system to silence critical reporting. When the final hammer fell and the comprehensive judgment was released, the collective sigh of relief across the newsrooms of the nation was deafening, marking the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of a massive celebration for the preservation of a free and fearless press. The total vindication delivered by the High Court marks a defining moment in the modern history of journalism, sending a powerful message that will echo through newsrooms and legal chambers for decades to come. While the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday have triumphantly seen off their most determined enemies in this monumental case, no one within the media industry should assume that those who wish to muzzle the press will simply creep away from the battlefield, never to cause trouble again. Prince Harry, who has waged a relentless 7-year war against the British press, and achieved notable past victories against the publishers of The Sun and the Daily Mirror, appears finally to have reached the end of his legal tether in this specific crusade. His reaction to the devastating loss, however, showed a remarkable lack of grace, as he quickly issued a public statement describing the judge's meticulous 436-page ruling as an obvious whitewash. This defiant attitude suggests that while he may be legally forced to desist from this particular line of attack, his deep-seated animosity toward independent reporting remains completely unchanged. At the same time, the activist group Hacked Off, along with its highly sympathetic voices occupying benches within the political establishment, showed absolutely no intention of halting their long-term campaign to curtail media freedom. Almost immediately following the announcement of the judgment, the organization displayed a staggering amount of brass neck by publicly demanding a fresh public inquiry, attempting to revive the ghost of the decades-old Leveson investigations under the guise of a so-called Leveson Part 2. The ultimate objective of these persistent critics has always been remarkably clear: to institute some form of rigid state oversight and statutory control that would effectively strip newspapers of their traditional independence and prevent them from investigating the lives of the rich, the powerful, and the influential. The survival of a completely free press depends entirely on constant vigilance, because even though this decisive battle has been brilliantly won, the broader war over who has the right to publish uncomfortable truths will never truly be over. There will always be wealthy chancers, embittered celebrities, and motivated political figures who will seek to use their enormous resources to silence critical voices, making the steadfastness of the journalists who held the line in these trying circumstances all the more admirable. To fully appreciate why this judicial triumph matters so deeply, one must look closely at the extraordinary backgrounds and historical intersections of the key participants whose lives and legacies were put on trial during this 11-week courtroom drama. The central figure whose professional reputation hung in the balance was Paul Dacre, an editorial titan who spent more than a quarter of a century transforming the Daily Mail into a dominant cultural and political force. Born in 1948, Dacre developed an uncanny, legendary understanding of the values, anxieties, and aspirations of middle-class citizens, turning his publication into a fierce advocate for ordinary people against a detached elite. His career was defined by an uncompromising, old-school style of investigative journalism that frequently put him at direct odds with powerful institutions, culminating in his famous decisions to challenge the legal establishment over the unsolved murder of Stephen Lawrence. To accuse a man of Dacre's immense stature of lying under oath to a public inquiry was a calculated attempt to dismantle the moral authority of his entire career, an effort that ultimately collapsed when the judge exposed the claims as entirely baseless and empty. The tragedy of the case was compounded by the involvement of Baroness Doreen Lawrence, a courageous mother who had been elevated to the House of Lords in recognition of her tireless, decades-long campaign for justice and institutional reform following her son's tragic death, for reasons that legal experts still struggle to fully comprehend. She allowed herself to be drawn into a coalition of wealthy litigants whose broader political goals were fundamentally aligned against the very media freedom that had once kept her son's case alive when the authorities had abandoned it. The late Max Mosley, whose bitter shadow loomed incredibly large over the entire lawsuit, represented an entirely different and darker motivation for targeting the press. Born into immense wealth and political infamy as the son of the notorious 1930s British fascist leader Sir Oswald Mosley and the aristocratic society figure Diana Mitford, Max Mosley spent much of his youth and adult life trying to escape or reshape his family's highly controversial legacy. After establishing a successful career as a barrister and a brilliant sports executive who completely modernized the multi-billion-dollar world of Formula One racing, his private life became the subject of intense media scrutiny. His furious, obsessive crusade against the male titles was deeply personal, driven by a desire for absolute vengeance after investigative reporters dug into historical archives to prove his direct connection to his father's extremist, racist political campaigns. Mosley's decision to use his vast, inherited fortune to systematically fund anti-press organizations and pay witnesses to come forward created a highly sophisticated, dangerous apparatus designed to bankrupt and destroy a national newspaper. The unraveling of this network in the High Court exposed how easily the legal system can be weaponized by ultra-wealthy individuals who harbor private vendettas against the journalists who expose their hidden histories. Beyond the personal dramas of the individuals involved, this historic judgment arrives at a critical turning point for the entire print media industry, providing a badly needed and profoundly welcome boost to professionals across the globe. For the past 2 decades, the traditional printed press has suffered from a relentless, painful decline in physical circulation, with many historic titles finding it incredibly difficult to navigate the rapid transition into the digital age. Amidst these harsh economic pressures, journalists have found themselves increasingly vulnerable to expensive legal threats, as wealthy subjects frequently use the threat of ruinous lawsuits to suppress unfavorable stories before they can ever reach the public. Had the High Court ruled in favor of the celebrity claimants, it would have created a terrifying, unworkable precedent that would have effectively chilled investigative journalism everywhere, making it far too risky for any publisher to challenge the official narratives of the rich and powerful. By delivering a total, unreserved dismissal of the allegations, Mr Justice Nicklin has successfully reinforced the foundational pillars of freedom of speech, ensuring that the press retains its vital, democratic right to report on the goings-on of the elite. This victory belongs not just to the 40 courageous writers and editors who stood trial, but to every single reporter who believes that truth and accountability must always prevail over wealth and influence. The line has been firmly held, the groundless conspiracies have been thoroughly exposed, and the integrity of independent journalism has emerged from the fires of the High Court stronger, more resilient, and more vital than ever before.